Much is made of Nazi technology from the Second World War. Indeed, so highly lauded is their tech in the popular zeitgeist that you barely have to spend 5 minutes discussing the topic until some veritable wrinkle brain emerges from the shadows to confidently declare that had Hitler only had a few more X, Ys or Zs, we'd all be speaking German now, you know? And such claims, however, are little but nonsense in reality. For starters, there's the fact that actually Nazi tech gets seriously overhyped. Take, for example, the Messerschmitt 262, which, while it indeed was the first ever jet-powered fighter, also had desperately brittle engines that simply couldn't be built properly due to a lack of key strategic resources, and as a result, lasted 25 hours max before they tore themselves apart and had to be swapped out. Then there's the fact that, contrary to the oft-touted claims, Germany's strategic situation was so dire come 1943 that there was quite literally nothing that could be done to reverse its fortune. Even a heavenly click of the fingers that made every German bomber an Arado 234 and every rifle an STG-44 would have achieved nothing but a delay of the inevitable. But just because that common claim is but twaddle, that doesn't mean we should jump to the other extreme and write all German gear off as being junk, because actually they did legitimately have some really good tech at their disposal. Chief among them, which was their camouflage, which they not only pioneered the use of, but were also the first military to roll out en masse. And today we'll be taking a deep dive into it. So let's begin. A claim that you'll often encounter is that the Nazi military was the first to roll out a printed camouflage pattern. But while they absolutely were trailblazers in this regard, they actually weren't the first to do so, with that claim to fame instead falling on one of the largest nations we commonly associate with cutting-edge military innovation in that period, Italy. More specifically, they introduced this so-called tello mimetico pattern all the way back in 1929. Given that before this, military camouflage amounted to paint on anything solid and fabric colours that just didn't stand out too much, you can see why the advent of tello mimetico was just a bit of a big deal. And if you want examples of the old fabric types, think the Feldgrau colour that Germany used on its field uniforms from the early 20th century, and the khaki drill colour that Britain also used on its field uniforms in the same period, and you have the idea. As for how they used it, they didn't just start pumping out tunics and trousers made from the stuff as you might imagine from how we use printed camouflage materials in the modern era, as that idea was still a bit down the pipeline. Instead, they started producing something called a tello tenda, a rather smart bit of kit that was essentially just a giant square of tello mimeto fabric that could be used either as a tarpaulin to provide some shelter or as a poncho to provide an individual with some camouflage. Come time with the Italian military having been rather pleased with their new fabric, they would eventually start making more and more garments out of it, with a particularly notable one being a paratrooper smock they rolled out in 1937, an example of which can be seen on the fella with his back to us on this photo. They also made a tunic and trousers set for their mountain troops, as you can see in this photo. But do know this particular set is rather contentious among historians, and a debate continues to play out as to whether or not it, which is very, very rarely spotted in photos, was ever issued from the top down, as it were, or was simply made on the local level by individuals and or their commanders. And with that cleared up, let's get back to the matter of hand, that being Germany's first dabbles with printed camouflage fabrics. Having dabbled a bit with the old school types on camouflage during World War I, notable examples of which include the retroactively dubbed turtle shell pattern, which you can see here, the Weimar era military was keen to explore the idea further, which led to the development of the so-called Buntfarbunterdruck 31, or colourful print 31, work on which began in 1931 and was soon wrapped up in 1932. As a print, it was characterised by its angular geometric shapes designed to mimic the effect of sunlight and shadows breaking through foliage. And because effective camouflage actually works by breaking up your shape rather than just blending you in with the environment, the pattern included sharp, irregular polygons and overlaid splinters that disrupt the human outline, making it harder for observers to identify a soldier's form at a distance. And naturally, because the tones of the print still do actually have to match the background, lest one just stand out like a sore thumb and render all that clever science about outline breaking moot. The print used green and brown tones on a tan background, exactly the colours one encounters in the European countryside. All of this came together to create a camouflage pattern that still remains perfectly viable even to the present day, and was nothing short of revolutionary at its creation. Much like the Italians and their tello mimetico pattern, however, the Germans didn't take the leap to making all of their field uniforms out of it, and instead they too also made a multi-purpose poncho-esque item, specifically the Zeltbahn 31 or Shelter Quarter 31. The Zeltbahn was quite a bit cleverer than the tello tender, however, because rather than just being able to be used as either a poncho or a partial weather shelter, the Zeltbahn was specifically shaped to be able to be used as a stretcher, a backpack of sorts to spread the weight of heavy loads on one's back. A poncho, a weather shelter, or even a full-blown tent. That last usage in particular is the cleverest of the lot too, because by issuing every German soldier a Zeltbahn and collapsible poles, no matter where they were or how cut off they may be from regular supply lines, they all had a tent ready to go if they simply pulled their Zeltbahns and snuggled up close, with the Zeltbahn being specifically sized so that just 4 of them buttoned together would give just enough space for 4 soldiers to squeeze in. But wait, there's more, because by specifically making it triangular, there was no limit to how large a pooled Zeltbahn tent could be, if you were clever about how you attached them anyway, which led to the regular creation of these enormous and quite spacious tents such as this one and this one. And that's all just from a bit of gear that weighed so little that you barely even noticed you were carrying it. Honestly, rockets and cruise missiles, if you want legitimately advanced German tech, this is it right here. But the Zeltbahn, incredible though it was, wasn't the only usage of colourful print 31, not by a long shot. Having been renamed to the much more military sounding Splittermuster 31 or Splinter Pattern 31 in 1935, and we aren't kidding on that point either, it lost its original name purely because it didn't sound mean and military enough. More and more items began to be made from it, with both helmet covers and smocks starting to be made from it from November 38 onwards. But do note, whereas the Zeltbahn was a standard issue item, one given to every soldier in the Wehrmacht, the helmet covers and smocks were niche items produced in comparatively tiny numbers. So small in fact that when they were typically issued just for specific high priority missions and then taken back to the quartermaster immediately afterwards. This is typified best by the 21st Panzer Division, the only Panzer Division to see combat on day 1 of Operation Overlord. They are a go-to unit to be portrayed by Hollywood, reenactors and wargamers alike, in no small part due to the fact that they went into battle that day wearing splinter pattern smocks and helmet covers, as you can see here and here. But whereas those groups often take these photos to mean the 21st Panzer in Normandy, called Camouflage, in reality they only had these issued because they happened to be on exercise on the day of the landings and they were taken back off them when they first rotated out of the front. Repelling the initial Allied invasion was not deemed important enough reason to dish out the splinter pattern smocks. That's how unfathomably rare and coveted they actually were. It's also worth noting that the Wehrmacht used a second splinter pattern, that being the so-called Luftwaffe Splittermuster 41 or Luftwaffe Splinter Pattern 41, and with a name like that, we're sure you've already twigged both exactly who it was for and when it started being used. That's right, it was for the Luftwaffe, and they started using it in 1941. Commonly known nowadays as Splinter Pattern B, with Pattern A referring to the normal variant we just discussed, Splinter B used the exact same pattern as Splinter A, just with Splinter B having its pattern be far smaller, with the logic being that it offered greater camouflage effectiveness due to the closer, smaller and greater number of contrasts in its colour and shape. It also stayed in production for barely 3 years, with it being dropped in 1944, by which time it had managed to find its way onto a myriad of specialist paratrooper equipment such as jump schmocks, helmet covers and bandoliers. And although the elite paratroopers got their pick of the Splinter B, some of it also ended up being issued to the very not elite Luftwaffe field divisions, who, despite being little more than airfield security guards pressed into a frontline role, they got their own unique style of them and their schmock issued in reasonable number. But while Splinter Pattern was by far the most common pattern seen amongst the ranks of the Wehrmacht, what with the Zeltbahn being a standard issued item and all, it was also not the only one they used, as another so-called Sumpfmuster 43 or Swamp Pattern 43, better known today simply as Tan and Water Pattern, was also issued. As you likely surmised from the name, this pattern was introduced in 1943 and was specifically intended to provide excellent levels of concealment in marshy landscapes, in addition to autumn and winter more generally. It was very much an evolution of Splinter Pattern, with the pattern itself consisting of a tan or beige base overlaid with forest green and dark brown blotches, rather than the sharp edges of Splinter Pattern. but still keeping the splinters running through it all. It had two variations as well, with Sumpfmuster 44 or Swamp Pattern 44 also being a thing. It was the exact same thing, just with the geometric shapes totally eliminated in favour of running pure with the blotchy approach. And be it the 43 or 44 variant, tan and water pattern was far rarer than splinter pattern, primarily because Zeltbands, i.e. a standard issue item, were not made from it, with tan and water instead being used exclusively on the other stuff like smocks, helmet covers and the like. As for how it was used, consider this summary. From 1943 the factories were pumping out both tan and water pattern as well as splinter pattern, and the same kind of garments ended up getting chucked into the same kinds of depots to get issued to the same kinds of units as and when they needed them. Basically, they both turn up late war whenever the Wehrmacht decided to dish out the good stuff. Both of the patterns we've discussed up until this point were exclusively for the use of the Wehrmacht, not the SS. Largely, and in theory anyway, as exceptions to this rule did exist, but they're just peculiar little quirks of circumstance. An SS soldier helping himself to some Gucci gear that was left unattended in a depot or was no longer needed by its original owner, etc., things like that. This naturally sparks a question, that being, what camouflage did the SS use, if indeed they did actually use any? Well, they certainly did, and far more so than the Wehrmacht. In fact, while the Wehrmacht's use of camouflage was revolutionary, what with being the first military organisation to give every one of its soldiers such a piece of gear, in addition to issuing some tarty stuff here and there, the effort was nothing compared to that of the SS, as they went full balls to the wall with it. More specifically, the SS boarded the camouflage hype train in 1935, when Sturmbannführer Wim Brandt, the commander of the SS VT Reconnaissance Battalion, found himself disappointed with the performance of splinter pattern and commissioned Johann Schick, an art professor at Munich University, to make him something better. Schick, who really put his mind to the task, made detailed notes on both the colour and pattern of forested landscape in both summer and autumn, and upon deciding that there was no one camouflage he could design that would really excel in both conditions, he had the genius idea of creating a reversible pattern, so that a soldier only had to be issued one bit of gear and he was good to go. Unfortunately for Schick, whereas the Wehrmacht would have told him to shove this idea right up his chutney thanks to the exorbitant cost of it, the nascent SS, which was only too eager to flash a bit of cash so that it could beat its chest and prove itself as a legit fighting organisation that was to be taken seriously, was only too happy to allow Schick to see his idea through to the bitter end. Schick's efforts eventually led to the rollout of the first SS print, so-called Plattenmuster, or plain tree pattern, in 1937. Which featured both spring and autumn sides of different colours that both used irregular, leaf-like blotches with various shades of green, brown and tan designed to mimic forest foliage, as well as overlapping shapes to create a layered effect that blends well with natural woodland environments, providing effective concealment in dense vegetation. As for what it was rolled out onto, it was first put onto Zeltbands, naturally, and they were issued and used in the exact same way as their splinter pattern Wehrmacht equivalents, so we won't worry too much about them. What we will worry about, however, is all the extra gubbins that was only a sideshow for the regular military, because that is what the SS really went mad with. For example, in 1938 they rolled out a smock, helmet cover and sniper's face mask, and get this, actually issued them on the regular. They weren't quite standard issue to all members of the SS though, don't get us wrong, as for example foreign volunteer units rarely seem to have got them at all. It was Nazi Germany after all, but neither did rear echelon troops from the Germanic divisions, as vehicle crews also typically didn't. After all, Germany's wartime economy wasn't exactly one rife with abundance, so some gear rationing still had to take place, even among Hitler's favourite troops. Those exceptions aside, however, it's fair to otherwise consider all of these items standard issue among the SS, at least as a general rule. And because the SS really got the taste for camouflage, they didn't just stop with plain tree pattern, nor even just a cheeky little extra one to supplement it that you hardly ever saw in the field, as they, via Schick's hand, would go on to produce a total of 4 more major patterns come the Reich's end, with plain tree pattern being discontinued in 1944, but continuing to appear until the end of World War II, as stocks of it already in circulation continued to be issued and used. The first of these other patterns was the so-called Eichenloh Muster, or oak leaf pattern, which was introduced between 1941 and 1945. It incorporated clusters of rounded, overlapping shapes resembling oak leaves, creating a layered, organic look. This pattern was designed in two primary variations, oak leaf A and oak leaf B, which are also known as ringed and regular among collectors to distinguish them. Both A and B also had their own seasonal colour changes, greens and tans for spring and summer, and brownish tones for fall and winter. Despite its differencing appearance, when all was said and done, oak leaf was used in the exact same way as plane tree for zeltbands and garments, and all in all, it was probably the most common. Then there was Rauchtern Muster, or blurred edge pattern, produced between 1941 and 44. It featured soft, overlapping shapes in muted colours such as greens, browns, and sometimes greys, giving it a blurred look. Much like tan and water, its design lacks hard edges, which enhances its effectiveness by blending smoothly with natural environments, especially in wooded or lightly vegetated areas. It too also came in spring/summer and fall/winter variants, and was used on zeltband smocks and bits and bobs. The next one is all the odder, however, as Palmenmuster, or palm tree pattern, as the name suggests, took its inspiration from palm trees, using an arrangement of elongated leaf-like shapes intended to mimic dense foliage. Palm tree pattern also bucks the trend that has otherwise been forming in this chapter, because while it too was double-sided, it was not used on zeltbands, instead just having its use reserved exclusively for smocks and helmet covers. It also wasn't very long-lived, as it was produced only between 1940 and 1942, and despite being very common come Operation Barbarossa, its stocks were largely exhausted come the close of 1943. And then we get the SS camo pattern, the really famous one that Hollywood, wargamers and reenactors alike can't seem to get enough of. Erbsenmuster, or P pattern, although you will often hear it referred to as P dot in common vernacular. It was designed with smaller, irregularly shaped dots in various shades of green, brown and beige, making it effective in mixed landscapes where soldiers needed to move seamlessly between foliage and open ground. It also had a major variation in how it was used as opposed to other SS patterns, because rather than the usual blend of zeltbands or bits, it was rolled out in 1944 as a normal uniform matching the shape of the model 1943 field uniform, with both tunics and trousers being made from it, as you can see here and here. As a result, they never made zeltbands, helmet covers, nor field caps from P dot, at least not from the factory, as invariably some would have gotten made in the field when spare fabric was recovered from the battlefield, but we're not aware of a single photo taken either now from a collection or from the period that shows such items, so when it did happen, it was beyond rare. While we're on that point too, you will often see photos incorrectly labelled as showing P dot helmet covers or field caps, when actually it's a totally different print on the aforementioned parts, with the person claiming it's simply not being that observant, an example of which you can see in this photo, in which the pictured soldier is wearing P dot fatigues, and if you look really closely, an oak leaf pattern helmet cover. And that is us done for SS camo, but before we can bring the video to a close, there's just one more pattern we have to discuss, one which was kind of used by both the SS and the Wehrmacht. Lebermuster was developed in 1945 by German engineer Helmut Leber, hence the name, which translates quite literally to Leber's pattern. It was the final camouflage pattern produced by Germany during the war and was intended to replace all existing camouflage in German use, aiming to lessen the logistical nightmare that the various mishmash of patterns used had become by that time, and also provide a more effective print as a cheeky bonus. Its design, as you can see, utilised bold, amoebic shapes in green and russet on a khaki background with a unique overprint of carbon black shapes. Notably, this pattern also incorporated features designed to disrupt early infrared detection systems, showcasing an advanced understanding of camouflage principles for the time. But while Lebermuster was absolutely issued, it was beyond rare, with most photos of it all coming from occupied Czechoslovakia right at the tail of the war, such as this one. Look really closely at the fella in the foreground and you'll spot it. And that should just about do us for today's video. Rather annoyingly, despite the detail we've gone into, this video should only really be considered a primer on the matter, as this topic is so surprisingly vast that it's simply impossible for us to cover the topic exhaustively within our format, as evidenced by the fact that Lorenzo Silvestri's Waffen SS camouflage uniforms and the go-to books on the topic pushes 1,000 pages between its 2 volumes, and it doesn't even cover Wehrmacht camouflage. So vast is the amount of camouflage gear that Germany actually made, and the myriad of variations and exceptions therein. As a primer, however, this should work absolutely grand for you, as you'll now have an understanding of all the different prints that existed, as well as some of the general history and context around them. So job's a good one as far as we're concerned. End of video.